Well, the pituitary gland is sometimes called the master gland in the body, and that's because it exerts influence over so many other glands in the endocrine system. So this is the gland that we're going to be starting with as we survey the major glands of the endocrine system. We've seen the pituitary gland before when we were in the brain, when we were talking about the forebrain and the diencephalon. We said there's the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then the pituitary gland kind of hangs off on the underside of the brain. And the hypothalamus exerts control over the pituitary gland. We'll be seeing that a little bit later, but its close proximity is really helpful in allowing that to happen. The pituitary gland has two different lobes. It has an anterior section and a posterior section. Anterior meaning on the side that's closer to the face, and then posterior is facing like the back of the brain. So two different lobes, and they are derived from different types of embryonic tissues. So one of the lobes of the pituitary gland is actually epithelial tissue, derived from epithelial tissue, and the other is from neural tissue. So they are quite different from each other in that regard, but in the adult brain they end up being fused together, and so we refer to them as sort of one unit, the pituitary gland. Okay, so let's start with the anterior pituitary. So the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, that's this portion right here. And this is the portion that's made from epithelial tissue, and it's glandular. So it is truly secreting like a gland. It's in the endocrine system, and it's secreting hormones that will go out into the bloodstream and influence a lot of different target organs throughout the body. So the anterior pituitary, the hormones that it produces are referred to as trophic hormones, and the word trophic means to feed. And what these hormones do, if they're present in high concentrations throughout the body, what they'll cause is for their target organs to grow, to hypertrophy. If these hormones are present in not very high concentrations, so if they're present in low concentrations, then conversely the target organs will start to atrophy. And so just collectively these are referred to as trophic hormones. It's just kind of a convenient way to refer to them. And what we are going to do is walk through 5 of the major hormones that the anterior pituitary secretes. So they are listed out in this figure here, and we'll go through them one by one. So again, coming from the anterior pituitary, hormones that this lobe of the pituitary secretes. First one is prolactin. Prolactin, we will abbreviate PRL. Prolactin is a hormone that circulates through the body, and its target cells are in the mammary glands. And this is the hormone that's needed to stimulate milk production in the mammary glands. Number 2, we've got growth hormone. Growth hormone targets a lot of different places throughout the body. In general, it promotes the uptake of amino acids and subsequent protein synthesis with those amino acids. And so it's a very good hormone for facilitating overall growth. In kids, this is the hormone, one of the hormones that's causing them to grow taller over time. Eventually the bones, the epiphyseal plates and the bones fuse together, and then further growth in terms of tallness stops. It's not possible to just keep growing forever because those plates fuse. But the growth hormones still are present in adults, and they cause other changes, like certain features start to change, and I don't know, facial appearances change over time as we get older. That's in part due to growth hormone. Next up, we've got thyroid stimulating hormone. This is a hormone that influences what the thyroid is doing. The thyroid is a gland that's in your neck, and it secretes thyroid hormones T3 and T4. We've seen these already when we were talking about non-polar hormones, how they can cross the plasma membrane and activate gene transcription inside of the cell. So anyway, thyroid stimulating hormone is what causes T3 and T4 to be released from the thyroid. So again, this is coming from the pituitary gland, and it causes these other hormones to be released. Next, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. This one we will be focused in on in the next section. This is a hormone that influences the adrenal cortex. The adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys, and they're they do a lot of different things, but one of the things that they do is secrete cortisol, which is our stress hormone. This is a very important hormone just in sort of mediating the response that we have to stressful situations. And then lastly, we have gonadotropic hormones, which are present in both males and females. Follicle stimulating hormone, what this does is promotes gamete formation in both the ovaries and the testes. And then the last one here on the list, luteinizing hormone. This one also targets the gonads, but this one is just facilitating the secretion of sex hormones. So not gamete production specifically, but just sex hormones in general. Okay, posterior pituitary. Very different style. Posterior pituitary, we've mentioned this one before. This should be a little bit of review. We've said that the posterior pituitary stores hormones that the hypothalamus makes. So if we just look at the way that, that these things are laid out. So here's the hypothalamus up in this region inside the brain, and the pituitary gland hangs down beneath it. The posterior pituitary gland, it has a direct connection to the hypothalamus. So there are some axons that extend from the hypothalamus directly down into the posterior pituitary. And the two hormones that get stored here, we've seen these before, this is review. Antidiuretic hormone. This is one that can go and act on the kidneys to help prevent water loss from the body. So it facilitates reabsorption of water in the kidneys. And the other hormone, again, review, oxytocin. This is the hormone that stimulates contractions during childbirth. It does a couple of other things as well that we're going to be a little bit more focused in this chapter. It stimulates, so the contractions of the uterus, that's one thing. It also stimulates contractions elsewhere, and particularly in the mammary glands. It facilitates contractions of those glands. And so that helps to cause the milk to be released from the gland. Okay, so that kind of brings up an interesting note. We said on the previous slide, well, prolactin is secreted by the anterior pituitary. Prolactin causes milk to be made. Oxytocin is important for allowing that milk to be released. So these two hormones have to work together. Oxytocin is something that is, again, it's stored in the posterior pituitary. It's not like it's just always being released necessarily. There has to be some sort of a stimulus that causes it to be released. And it is actually the baby sucking that sends a sensory neuron signal up to the brain. And then the hypothalamus causes the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. And that oxytocin travels through the bloodstream, it causes milk to be released. So for those of you who are moms out there, you're already familiar with this. If you've ever nursed a baby, it's not like it's not like drinking from a straw. It's not like milk is instantly available. It's something the baby has to start sucking, and then there's a little bit of a lag, a little bit of a delay, and that's just because it takes some time for oxytocin to circulate through the body and make it to the mammary glands and cause that milk to be released. So, on that note, let's tie in with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls both lobes of the pituitary gland, both the anterior and posterior. Let's just look at that in a little bit more detail here. So the posterior pituitary, what we've just been talking about, again, that's got a direct connection to the hypothalamus. So these axons descend directly into the posterior pituitary and allow these two hormones to be released. The anterior pituitary, this one is also controlled by the hypothalamus, but in a different way. So there's not a direct connection with axons into the anterior pituitary. Rather, it goes something like this. Okay, so up here in the hypothalamus, there are axons that descend down to, this area is called the median eminence. That name is right here. And those axons carry hormones. So hormones get transported down the axons and they get released in the median eminence. And then there are capillaries. There's a capillary bed right there at the median eminence, and that capillary bed leads directly to another capillary bed in the anterior pituitary. So there is a direct connection through the bloodstream right there, just through these capillary beds. So anyway, the hormones from the hypothalamus get released right there, and they travel through the bloodstream and cause the anterior pituitary to do what it does. So the hypothalamus has many different hormones it can release. All these little green dots are representing hormones. There are many different types of hormones. Let me just show you a table here. Okay, so these are hormones that the hypothalamus produces, and then they can travel to the anterior pituitary through the bloodstream and cause the anterior pituitary to secrete hormones. So this is like a whole chain of hormones. Hypothalamus produces hormones that influences the anterior pituitary, and then anterior pituitary releases hormones that go and affect other target organs throughout the body. So this is truly the endocrine system. It involves a lot of interconnections, interconnected sections throughout the body. So anyway, we can refer to this table on an as-needed basis, but just to point out a couple as an example. So the hypothalamus produces what's called corticotropin releasing hormone. What this is going to do is cause the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which we're going to see a little bit later. This is the hormone that acts on the adrenal glands. Okay, let's just look at one other here. I think on the next slide we're going to have gonadotropin releasing hormone. So this is one that is, again, produced by the hypothalamus, travels through the capillary beds down to the anterior pituitary, and at the anterior pituitary it causes these two hormones to be released, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So those will go then travel through the bloodstream and influence what the gonads are doing. So that brings us to the topic of feedback control. We've got these sorts of chains of molecules that are influencing each other, chains of organs that are influencing each other, and there has to be some way to control the release of these different substances. So this forms what's called an axis. So we've been talking about what the hypothalamus does. The hypothalamus produces hormones that then influence the anterior pituitary, which then produces hormones that influence other organs. So there's like a three system link here, three member link, and together they are called an axis. So in the case of gonadotropin releasing hormone, produced by the hypothalamus, again, that will make the anterior pituitary produce gonadotropins. Those circulate throughout the body, and when they make their way to the gonads, they cause the gonads to release sex steroid hormones. Okay, once there are sex steroid hormones circulating in the bloodstream, there are two things that can do. Number one, that concentration of sex steroids, that can exert a direct negative feedback onto the anterior pituitary. It causes the anterior pituitary to not be as sensitive to gonadotropin releasing hormone. So consequently, the anterior pituitary is going to stop secreting so many gonadotropins. So that's a negative feedback loop. It's going to cause the escalation of sex steroids to stop and to level off. The other thing that's shown here on the slide is that there's another type of negative feedback. There are actually two sorts of levels of negative feedback control that are possible in this axis. So the sex steroid hormones that are produced, that's like the end product of this whole system. Again, those are circulating throughout the blood, and those actually go and influence the hypothalamus directly as well. Causes the hypothalamus to stop secreting its hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone. So two different levels of negative feedback control are possible here. All right, so next up, we're going to look at the adrenal glands, which, let me just scroll back for 1 second here. Again, the adrenal glands are also ultimately stimulated by what the hypothalamus is doing. Corticotropin releasing hormone is produced by the hypothalamus. That travels to the anterior pituitary and causes the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is going to circulate through the bloodstream and make its way to the adrenal gland. So that's where we're going to pick up next.